Jinalunguna mijini durali. Jinalunguna mijini durali.
Warami Midiga, hello friends. Bujuri Najunya, Dharug Nurura. Good to see you on Dharug country. Welcome to 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin's audio walk at North Richmond. Naya Gyara Dom. My name's Dom. Naya Dharug Burubiranggal Nuragu. I belong to the Burubiranggal clan of the Dharug people. Bayaju Gulbanga Gununyang Yura Kurrajong Yagu Badapagu Dharug Yura. I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Yanawiju, Manawiwa, Muru, Warangad. Walk with me in the footsteps of our ancestors. Naraji, Dabu Mili, Dyarubbin Gu. Listen to the story of our Dyarubbin. The river Dyarubbin is our ancestor, a living, breathing being, sung into existence from creation. The river holds our dreaming, creation stories and songlines, connecting us across countries and nations. Dyarubbin carries a shared creation story of Gurrangach, the great eel. The river is our home, from Marrang Hill Camp, Windsor and Marrang Ngurra, the camp on the sea in Richmond, to our Dyarubbin corroboree place, where Dyarubbin and Wyanamata South Creek meet. We look to Naranyambai, place of the old women, and Garamulamalu, place of the falling stars. Remember Midiga, tread softly on this dreaming. We were strong here, we remain strong here. We will always be strong here.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this audio walk contains stories of historical violence and Aboriginal people now resting in the dreaming. Listen and enjoy the stories, but please do not reproduce them in any way. Didgeridoo, thank you.
Kui, Yanma, come, walk with me to the river, on the path that takes us down to the jetty and the water's edge, and listen to the stories of this place. On this side of the river, the ground rises steadily behind us into the foothills of Gullamata, the Blue Mountains. But across the river is the low sweeping Richmond floodplain, where this ancient river has deposited layers and layers of silt over millions of years, and my people called Marrang Ngurra, sand camp.
My name is Dom Wilkins. I am a Burubiranggal woman from my paternal grandfather. Burubiranggal is a group of people or a clan, one of 30-something areas inside the Dharug Nation. It sits along the Hawkesbury River. Burubiranggal is the grey kangaroo people of the Dharug. We believe that the grey kangaroo will guide us and educate us through life. Clan area, our boundary areas, were landmarked in geographical feature. So whether it be a certain twist of the river, whether it be landform change, or these days we look at it as an ecological transition. Originally, the river was part of our life. Just like the land gives us our food and our energy, our connection, so do the waterways. So the waterways give us our food, give us our livelihood. I made a transporting canoe. Everyday life was centralised around the river life for a lot of our people. The Hawkesbury Nepean had an abundance of yams, and they were a staple diet. We would dig them up, take what was needed, and then replant them down so that they could continue to grow. The way that we obtained our food was always in the thought of not to be greedy, not to take in excess, and to always leave it for future days ahead.
Grace Karskens, Emeritus Professor of History at University of New South Wales and author of People of the River.
The early officers wrote down the name for the river as Dyarubbin. Usually the D comes with a J, Dyarubbin, and I came across a word exactly like that in Gadangara. Dyarubbin is yam in Gadangara. often there's like 50% cognate words, so the words overlap. So if you find one in one language, it could easily be in another one as well. It's just that it hasn't been recorded. There's also a word in the dictionary that we have for Darkanyung called Dyarubbin. It's for creek, right? So it has something to do with a watercourse. Again, it could mean watercourse and yam, because names sort of share. Happens in English too, same word for two different things. So another example is Kurrajong, which is a tree. It's also a number of plants. They all are linked by the fact that you can make string and line out of them. And the Kurrajong, as we used to call it, is obviously a place where women used to go and get that material. It's a native hibiscus and also a reed. They're also called Kurrajong because you make string and line out of them. But the Kurrajong and Dyarubbin are both women's names because women harvest yams and pound them up and make food out of them. And they also harvest the material they need to make their string, their fishing line, their net bags.
Let's stop by the jetty and look out over the river and its deep time history. Dyarubbin's catchment begins with the headwaters of the Wallandilly River near Goulburn, flowing 472 kilometres to the sea, becoming the Warragamba, Nepean, then Hawkesbury rivers, bringing with it the waters of the Coxes, Natai, Cowmong and Gross rivers, passing through Gudangara, Wiradjuri and Dharawal country before reaching us here on Dharug country, then heading through Darkanyung and Gurungai countries to the sea at Broken Bay, north of Palm Beach. This river system, much older than people, has been shaping and reshaping Ngurra country over 200 million years. My people engraved this creation story into rock platforms along the riverbanks in the form of the great eel, Gurungach and his children. Major flooding in 2020, 2021 and 2022 scoured the riverbanks here and pushed over many of the remaining Gamun sheet oaks. Before European colonists cleared it for farming, this country was covered in Dagga river flat forest, which would have held the riverbanks together and significantly slowed erosion. Upriver, to our right, at the end of this strait, sits Richmond Hill, a prominent knoll perched just above the river, which early explorers climbed. Richmond Hill is where the St John of God Hospital is now situated in Grosvale. Richmond and North Richmond took their European names from this hill, but before that, Richmond Hill was a significant place for our people, who continued to live there as long as they could. At the foot of Richmond Hill, there are rocks on the riverbanks with many grinding grooves made by my people while sharpening their tools.
Hi, my name is Jan Barclay-Jack. I've had a long interest in the Hawkesbury district and have written a couple of books about the area because I find it so fascinating. Philip and Hunter and other gentlemen and a couple of convicts came up the river in 1789. They went up as far as they could in the boats. And that's when they came to Richmond Hill, which they named after the similarity to the Richmond Hill in London. When they pulled in their longboats, they had a bit of a climb. They went to the top and observed the landmarks that they already knew from Sydney to try and get their bearings, and they planted some seeds to assess the fertility of the land. On that trip, they studied the landscape pretty closely as they went along. They could see evidence that there had been digging on the banks for something that they identified as being a small yam.
Let's head along the path now, which takes us under the bridge. On our way, we'll pause at the wooden foundations of the 1860 bridge, Gamunwa, under the river she oaks, just before the concrete bridge on our right.
The construction of the 1860 wooden bridge was funded by a group of local businessmen. It was a low-level bridge with 19 spans, covering about 164 metres, and was a toll bridge until the government purchased it in 1876. The locals of South Kurrajong, as North Richmond was then called, would go all the way to the ford at Ashton's Falls, just down from where the Gross River comes in at Yarramundi, to avoid paying the toll on this wooden bridge. Flooding in 1890 caused a new channel to be carved on the Richmond side, and repairs to the bridge were needed. It was damaged again by floods in 1900. So much silt had accumulated under it that the slightest flood resulted in the decks being inundated and the road closed. Before the wooden bridge, a punt carried mainly drovers and their herds across the river here, heading west to the plains of Wiradjuri country.
Let's keep moving along the path under the bridge, crossing under Bell's line of road, named after Archibald Bell Jr. His free settler father and magistrate, Archibald Bell, was granted 1,500 acres on Richmond Hill in the early 1800s, the Belmont estate. In 1823, Archibald Bell Jr. was shown this route over the mountains by a Dharug woman.
One of the strategies that Aboriginal people had to survive, and this is right across Australia, is what they called sitting down on an estate. And one of those estates on the Hawkesbury was Belmont, the famous property of Archibald Bell. The Belmont tribe was very well known right through the 19th century and is probably the same group as what we call the Richmond tribe, who were Dharug people that lived in that area for perhaps 50,000 years. Most of these big estates had Aboriginal people living on them, not permanently, but as a home base, as they carried on as best they could their traditional lives and their sacred rituals and their socialising. So Belmont becomes an Aboriginal centre for that. The Hawkesbury is really rich in stories, settler stories, orally told on the river, were actually written down towards the end of the century. And one of those stories is that enemy groups from the Wiradjuri country on the other side of the mountains would regularly come over the mountains and attack the local people in fights and contests and steal Dharug women and take them away with them. Now, we have to remember that this is a white way of seeing Aboriginal movements and contests, and they had very little knowledge about what they were actually doing. So that would have been the white interpretation. However, this particular story says that some Wiradjuri men came and took some Dharug women away, and that one of the women from Richmond Hill returned to her homelands. Apparently she was a member of the tribe that sat down at Belmont, knew Archibald Bell Jr., who was the son of the landowner, and she led him back over the mountains and into the west via what is still known as Bell's line of road.
Another of these local oral stories tells us that the first Belmont homestead was built over Dharug rock engravings. This was an important site for my people.
As we come up from under the bridge, stop and look at the riverbank on the other side of the river. This is Phil's Forest, where a group of bush regeneration volunteers work once a month. Hawkesbury City Council's Community Bush Care Officer, Marty Gauchi, with Bush Regen volunteers Jeff Cottrell and Fred Wood.
The volunteers named that site Phil's Forest because of a gentleman called Phil Nobbs, and he originally was restoring that site. He only stopped around about, say, 8 years ago. He just didn't like the weeds, and he remembered what the river was like when he was a kid. He used to swim in the river for swimming competitions. That was their school swimming carnivals. They would be swimming in the river. A lot of those trees that are 20 metres tall, Phil planted those. He collected the seeds from that site, off the casuarinas, the mandrills and blue gums, and he grew them at home. And then him and his sons, they weeded the area, got that area under control, and then planted. And then council realised, hey man, this guy's doing such a great job, we need to support him.
So that was about 30 years ago they started and planted these trees that you can see here.
These big casuarinas.
Yeah, and the gums and everything, yeah. So there's a lot of planting here.
And the red cedar as well.
Yeah.
So the floods come through and they wipe out balloon vine. Balloon vine grows over everything. So right now, you can't see any balloon vine. So one of the things you notice is that goes. So after that, you've got a window to knock it back even further. Pretty easy to get rid of in terms of it takes about 2 or 3 years, but it keeps coming because it's all upstream. So the flood takes it out, but also brings stuff in, and then brings debris piles. Trees fall over, so there's a change. The problem with trees falling over, they hide places for some of the worst weeds. It's hard to get at, so that becomes a problem. The good thing about trees falling over is it provides habitat, a wide range of small animals, insects and whatnot.
The river needs a flush because the plants that naturally occur along there, say for example like the river she oak, they would every now and then need a bare soil for the native seeds to take. A bit like a nursery, you lay the bare potting mix, lay all the seeds and all the seeds will germinate. And then after the flood, that 1 foot of siltation, all the natives started germinating. All those seeds have been transported from higher up the catchment, say the Blue Mountain, the Grace River, and then those natives start coming up. But with the farms and chemicals and fertilisers, so too does the high nutrient, and the high nutrient comes increased weeds, and that's where the massive problem lies, because the weeds will really quickly, especially on a riverbank, will outcompete the native plants. And the native plants, they don't like phosphorus and they don't like high nutrient.
Let's continue heading upriver along the path. John Town was one of the men who paid for construction of the 1860 wooden bridge. It would have been good for business, as he'd bought land right here where we are in 1830 and built and ran the Woolpack Inn, shown in Arthur Streeton's painting The Old Inn. Renowned Australian artist Arthur Streeton stayed near here, painting several local landscapes in the late 1800s. John Town, an ex-convict, went on to own both the Kurrajong water mills on Little Weenie Creek and build a huge pastoral empire. The land he bought along the river here had been granted to ex-convicts in 1799, about 5 years after Europeans moved in and took up land on the river near Windsor. Without any agreement or negotiation with the river's first people, the British government granted riverfront land to ex-convicts, free settlers and soldiers to farm. They cleared the forest by hand to plant crops of wheat and maize. For most ex-convicts, owning riverfront land would have been beyond their wildest dreams. The place we're standing on now was a 30-acre grant to Rachel Burton, one of very few women to receive a land grant.
For our people, the arrival of colonisers impacted our ability to cultivate and harvest midgeon, yams, along the fertile riverbanks here, a staple food which didn't require clearing of the forest. The more settlers took up land on the river, the more difficult it became for our people to access the river, our resources, pathways and ceremonial grounds, and conflict followed. Along the river, our women led maize raids, collecting corn from farms that had cleared their midgeon yams. But our people were also looking out for the newcomers who didn't know the river. In March 1799, Aboriginal people tried to warn the colonists of a flood, but Europeans could see no sign of it and ignored the warning. In the morning they woke to find the whole country underwater.
The impact of major flooding in 2021 and 2022 came as a surprise to many of the area's newer residents. It had been 30 years since the previous major flood in 1990. Tom Hubble, Associate Professor of Geology at Sydney University, explains the theory of the 80 to 100 year flood cycle.
But even the span of a human lifetime is not really long enough to witness the full range of cyclic rainfall, cyclic river flow and the life cycle of a lot of the trees. A colleague of mine, Robin Warner, a professor of geography, is a rivers expert, in the early 1970s, working with reasonably good rainfall records that went back to the 1880s, roughly. He was able to establish an idea that the river flow patterns seem to be really quite cyclic, and Rob called it a drought-dominated regime, where most of the floods that did happen would be relatively small, maintained within the riverbanks, and fairly infrequent. So a smaller number of smaller floods would occur, and that was related to decades or so of fairly dry conditions. So, like the Federation drought, right through until the end of the Second World War and a bit beyond, there was a big drought that affected New South Wales during the war. And then in 1950, everything seemed to change. We got much larger rainstorms, lots more of them, and we started to get some of these big flows. Right through the 50s, there were a large number of much larger floods. That period of flooding went on for about 40 years, from about 1949 right through until the early 90s, and then it went back to being dry again. We haven't really had any big floods until the last couple of years, and it's 1990 that the last one of similar size came through. And that fit exactly with the model that Rob had proposed, that over a period of somewhere between 80 and 100 years, we'd experience about half the time in dry weather and about half the time in wet weather. And that is similar to the El Nino and La Nina cycle, which is anywhere between 3 and 7 years, where we go in El Nino, we get really dry conditions, and then we'll have a La Nina event and we'll get lots of flooding. To have a 40 or 50 year period of relatively dry conditions followed by relatively wet conditions needs some other large scale atmospheric climatic driver. And possible culprits for that, and it's becoming pretty well recognised, is the Indian Ocean Dipole and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. There's also another major current that feeds into that, which is the Circumantarctic current. And so it's the synchronisation of these different oceanic circulations that are probably driving these long periods of dry weather and long periods of really wet weather.
As we continue along the path, the grassed area narrows. We'll pass on our left a place where significant bush regeneration to rehabilitate around 500 metres of riverbank was undertaken by volunteers from the Society for Growing Australian Plants. From 1995 to 2005, over 4,000 trees and plants were raised for this site. Planting a mix of shrubs, trees and grasses, which have root systems at different depths and grow to various heights, helps to stabilise the riverbank and prevent erosion. Even weeds are better than bare soil. Hawkesbury Council does some small-scale maintenance of the site.
We're approaching the foot of Richmond Hill, where Governor Phillip's 1789 exploratory trip recorded seeing animal traps and possum skin cloaks made by my people. Judge Advocate David Collins.
At the foot of Richmond Hill, I found several places constructed expressly for the purpose of ensnaring animals or birds. Wide enough at the entrance to admit a person, but tapering away gradually from the entrance to the end and terminating in a wicket grate. It was between 40 and 50 feet in length. On each side the earth was thrown up, and the whole was constructed of weeds, rushes and brambles, but so well secured that an animal once within it could not possibly liberate itself. We supposed that the prey, be it beast or bird, was hunted and driven into this toil, and concluded from finding one of them destroyed by fire that they force it to the grated end, where it is soon killed by their spears. In one I saw a common rat, in another the feathers of a quail.
Governor Phillip.
A small cloak has been found, made of the skins of the opossum and flying squirrel, very neatly sewed together, the inside ornamented in diamonds of curved lines by raising the skin with the point of a small bone, which is made sharp for that purpose. This cloak they put over their heads when they sleep, and cloaks made by beating the bark of the gum tree are common and used for the same purpose, or to keep the rain from their heads and shoulders.
When we're talking about Dharug people in relation to spiritual connection through totems, the Dharug women are wali, which is the brush-tailed possum, which means that we can't hunt or harm the possum, yet possum skins are important to the women and the children as a form of warmth or clothing. A lot of our children were given what's called budbili, or badbili, possum skin blankets. So the Dharug men are flying fox or nunu, which allows them to be able to hunt the possums. So whether it be climbing a tree, smoking out a tree, hitting the tree to encourage the possum to come down or come out of the hollow because it's thinking that it's like a goanna or someone. The men were the ones that were to hunt the possum, and then they pass over the skins to the women, who then go through the process of turning a pelt into a blanket.
Before we reach the end of this path, it will become a narrow dirt track. We'll climb some stairs before reaching another open parkland, where we'll stop a while. Following the 1789 trip up the river, Governor Phillip made another journey to the river on foot in 1791 and was welcomed to country at Burubiranggal Creek near Pitt-town by my ancestors, elders and Garachi, clever men, Goomberi and Yarramundi. A few months later, Watkin Tench made another expedition to this part of the river.
Captain Tench led a third exploration from Richmond Hill back down the river until he reached the South Creek and the area in which they'd met the elders. He had similar, very friendly meetings with different Aboriginal people around what we today call North Richmond.
When we had reached within 2 miles of Richmond Hill, we heard a native call. We directly answered him and conversed across the river for some time. At length, he launched his canoe and crossed to us without distrust or hesitation. We had never seen him before, but he appeared to know our friend Goomberi, of whom he often spoke. He said his name was Dyarubbin. He presented us with 2 spears and a throwing stick, and in return we gave him some bread and beef. Captain Watkin Tench. A complete account of the settlement at Port Jackson.
The caring, friendly nature of the Aboriginal people is astounding. Tench and his party wanted to cross the river and explore what we today would call Kurrajong. And the Aboriginal people obligingly ferried not only the people of the party across the river, but all their belongings and all their paraphernalia that they needed for camping. And it took them 3 trips to get them all across the river. One of the interesting things was that they demonstrated how they got small birds and other food sources out of trees by actually showing how they used the hatchet to make footholds in the tree and then climb.
During this long trial of their patience and courtesy, they had manifested no ungenerous sign of taking advantage of the helplessness and dependence of our situation. No rude curiosity to pry into the packages with which they were entrusted, or no desire to possess the contents of them. Let the banks of those rivers, known to song, let him whose travels have lain amongst polished nations, produce me a brighter example of disinterested urbanity than was shown to a set of destitute wanderers on the side of the Hawkesbury.
Once you've reached the open parkland, continue a little further down the grassy slope to a low drainage point where stormwater and runoff travel to the river. We're listening to the underwater sound of Dyarubbin, where this runoff enters the river. Just upstream from here is the intake for Sydney Water's North Richmond water supply, which supplies drinking water to local towns Richmond, North Richmond, Kurrajong, Glossodia, Windsor, Pitt Town, Londonderry and Windsor Downs. Through the trees here is a narrow, overgrown track that leads down to some rocks at the water's edge. If you're in sturdy shoes and feeling adventurous, you might like to explore it. There may be wildlife, so please take care. From the river here, you can just see the yellow floating booms of Sydney Water's intake, upstream. 2 kilometres downriver, at the other end of Hanna Park, beyond where we started our walk, Redbank Creek, which flows down from Kurrajong, enters the river, bringing with it treated sewage from the local sewage treatment plant at North Richmond. Ecologist Tom Cavell.
Where I live now in North Richmond, I've got Redbank Creek, and the sewage treatment plant's just down the road from me, and I've looked at all the water bugs around there. I also know where the intake for North Richmond's water is because I used to swim there when I was in high school. You've got all these sewage treatment plants along the whole catchment. We're definitely drinking recycled poo water. It's tidal all the way to Yarramundis. If you go to North Richmond and you sit there, you'll see it drop down and come up. It's a concern, but that's nearly all waterways in New South Wales have got some sort of load of nutrients from STPs or agriculture. When I would wag school, I'd catch the bus I used to ride to school, quickly nip out before the teachers would see us, and we'd go straight down the Hawkesbury, North Richmond, and we'd go down the steep banks and we'd take buckets with us and we'd make water slides going into the river. And I remember once, and I noticed that there were some eggs that were in the soil, and I took them home, and I'd kept lizards for a few years by this point, and I incubated them. They were all a whole heap of baby water dragons, which I ended up taking back and letting go down the Hawkesbury. And for me, being down there was a constant source of adventure as well. You know, we used to snorkel a lot, and you could see Sydney short-necked turtles under the water. It used to have all that alligator weed, the long strappy plant that grows under the water, which recently got scrubbed away with the flood. It's looking really beautiful and sandy. I don't view the river just on its own. For me, I think about it as a catchment. It is all interconnected via water and everything living here, all the biota. I look at the whole Cumberland Plain. There's lots of its floodplains. It's a network of now farmed dams, it was lagoons, and that's what keeps the whole river healthy. It's South Creek, it's Backawanamata. It needs all of it. So if we want to get the health of the Hawkesbury River really to a high standard, it needs good buffer zones, and that means nice, beautiful, wide, what we call riparian corridors, nice big buffers of bush around all the creeks and obviously the river. And it serves multiple purposes. From our perspective, it provides clean water. And that's crucial to the whole catchment and us, because it's, think about business and economy, that's, you know, people's livelihoods downstream. It's the fisheries, so prawns, oysters. It's also people getting to the river and recreationally using it, water skiing, wakeboarding, swimming, kayaking. I mean, I love kayaking down there. You've got people recreationally fishing. I have my grievances with water skiing and wakeboarding in particular, and undercutting the banks. But we have to recognise that's how a lot of people connect to the natural world and still love it. And nobody likes blue-green algal blooms. So for me, I would love to see the landscape managed as a whole in that way. And then that comes back to the wildlife. And I include us as the wildlife. I think we're the human animal and we forget that all the time. And if we have good corridors through the creeks and through the Hawkesbury River and the Nepean, it's a highway for all sorts of different animals and plants to move through the landscape. So down here in Little Weenie Creek, there's a good population of yellow-bellied gliders. We've got koalas moving from the Blue Mountains down onto the plains of Western Sydney. I've seen squirrel gliders here, sugar gliders. I've seen beautiful lace monitors, powerful owls. I know there's sooty owls not far from here. Booble cows. You've got platypus utilising this creek. You've got big spiny crays. So there's a lot through here that people don't know, and they don't recognise that this bush is not only home for animals, but it's important to us.
If you're not going to take the overgrown track, when you're ready, you could start heading back towards the bridge. The first extraction pump for drinking water at North Richmond was installed on the river here in 1943. There was no treatment or filtration of drinking water until 1963.
I'm Lachlan. I'm the manager for the water filtration plant at North Richmond, which is just down the road. It's upstream of the bridge. It's downstream of where the gross comes in. We take the water from the river, we call that raw water, and we treat it to make it into drinking water for the community around here. And that's about 50,000 people, and the plant can produce 50 million litres of drinking water a day. We pump the water from the river. We've got 2 pumping stations. We've got an older one and we've got a newer one that was built in the 90s. We then have 2 options for pre-treating it. So we've got a clarifier that removes larger particles. The other one is a dissolved air flotation. It dissolves really fine bubbles in the water. They float to the surface. It floats the algae to the surface and we skim it off the top. It's either or for that. We can't use both of those processes. And then that goes into our filters. They're a dual media filter, so they have anthracite and sand in them. So there's all sorts of pathogens, Cryptosporidium giardia, there's some viral pathogens in there as well. The majority of those are removed in the first 2 stages, so the pre-treatment or the filtration. The water that comes out of those is very, very clear water. So then after the filtration, being on a river, you're susceptible to getting taste and odour from algae and the stuff that's in the river. The river has a smell. So we actually run that through an activated carbon filter, and that takes out any taste and odour that's left. And also potentially if there was algal toxins in there, that will remove those as well. So by the time it's run through all of that, it's gone from the river water, which has got algae and larger particles in it, to clear, good tasting water. We then chlorinate it as well, so we disinfect with chlorine, and we also add fluoride because that's a requirement from health. Then it goes into 2 reservoirs on top of the hill, and then from there it's distributed out into the system. Flooding generally doesn't affect us for long. We monitor the river online. If we see that it's changing rapidly in a bad way, we can actually, because we've got plenty of storage, we can just turn the plant off and let that first flush pass through. The only thing with drought is we probably see more algae because the water's warmer and the water level's lower. There are wastewater treatment plants upstream of the plant. If you look at any catchment, even Warragamba catchment, you've got Goulburn up at the top of that catchment area. So you can always argue that you've got wastewater entering the river. The proportion may change in this river. It's treated wastewater. It's not raw sewage being discharged in there either. The wastewater treatment plants upstream, some of them have tertiary treatment, which is just about potable. And if you treat it adequately, it's safe to then be withdrawn and treated by a modern water filtration plant.
Flooding in 1961 caused the water supply pump to be buried in sand, and water supply to the local area was cut off for several days. If you haven't already, start making your way back towards the bridge. Farmer Bob Power bought land over the river from here in the 1920s and planted oranges. Bob attended Hawkesbury Agricultural College in Richmond and recalls students swimming in the river. Australian Olympic swimmer Andrew Boy Charlton was also a student at the college in the 1920s and used to train in the river. Bob Power was interviewed in 1984 for the On the Record Oral History Project.
That's how I started off here, and I had to carry water up in buckets from the river. There was no tanks or anything, and no electricity, only oil lamps. And then I planted the orchard, and then since it takes about 7 years to get a decent crop of oranges off a tree, I had to live in the meantime. So I planted peas between the orange trees, and at one stage, if you put all the rows of peas end to end, I would have had 35 miles of peas. And no irrigation. It was years afterwards before we got irrigation. And then I went in for growing lucerne. The dairymen in the suburbs used to have farms in the suburbs, you see, in their cows. Then they started subdividing their farms during the Depression, but they couldn't grow their feed. So I grew some lucerne and supplied a couple of dairy farmers. Before long, I was cutting it by the tonne with the mower and horses and selling it by the hundredweight. In those days, they used to feed green lucerne to the chooks every day, and the poultry farms kept me going for years while the Depression was on and the trees were growing. Most of the irrigation went round Windsor way, and it was flood irrigation too. They'd run it down furrows. They didn't have sprinklers much in those days. Anyway, my neighbour, he came and he bought an old car engine for £5, put a pulley on it, and had a big 4-inch flat belt going from that to the pump. And he used to pump water up and run it down the furrows between his cauliflowers. And then I did the same. And then later on I got sprays. Everybody sprays now.
Oranges are still grown just across the river here on the Richmond floodplain, as well as nuts, vegetables and turf, grazing and horse studs, all thriving on the rich alluvial soils the river has deposited here for millennia.
The history of the invasion of Dyarubbin was recorded in journals, notebooks and letters by Europeans, so we only have glimpses through a European lens of how our people initially reacted to the newcomers, as curious, but also weary of what was happening and what the strangers might want. Let's take a minute to imagine what our people perceived. Strangers with pale skin, speaking an unknown tongue, carrying new tools of magic. Were they ancestors returning? Were they Garachi, clevermen? Was this the language of the creators and the Skyfathers? The story tells that Dharug warrior Pamaway from the Bidjigal clan dreamt of the colonisers' arrival. To make sense of these new people in boats, it said he dreamt of a large pelican, white skin in the distance, on a large log or canoe, their boats. Remembering that our people were and still are very spiritual, stories of shape-shifting were part of our usual way of understanding and perceiving the world. Gurrangach, the great eel and creator of the river in our dreaming, is also depicted in rock carvings on the river's edge as a shapeshifter. Here on the river, our ancestors, Yarramundi and Gomberi, were initially welcoming of the strangers.
Ngaya, Jasmine, Burubiranggal, Dharug. I am Jasmine from the Grey Kangaroo people of the Sydney Basin area. I am the 5 times great granddaughter of Maria Locke and the 3 times great granddaughter of Hanna Locke. Hannah's family, they travelled to Hawkesbury by boat constantly, so they spent a lot of time on the river. They had an orange orchard. They grew up fishing for perch and mullet and just living by and off the river. My family have always lived along the Dyarubbin. The idea that the Aboriginal people were so generous to the settlers because they believed they were their ancestors returning, I think is extraordinarily beautiful. And I'm not surprised by that at all, because I think Aboriginal people are very welcoming. And if you've ever read the Bill Gammage book, The Greatest Estate on Earth, and he writes in there that Aboriginal people with their management of land actually had a lot of leisure time, and most of that time was spent being spiritual. So they're a deeply spiritual group of people who are very in touch with doing the right thing as well, because that's what they're doing with country. And so to see these people come back, they don't approach them with hard hearts. When they start to experience what the Europeans do to them, we know they do start to fight back. It's never a case of that they didn't fight back.
It was 1794 when Europeans moved in along the river. Initially around Dyarubbin, our corroboree place near Windsor, where Wyanamata South Creek and Dyarubbin meet. Spreading quickly along the river, settlers cleared the river flat forest to make their farms. News of the fertile alluvial soil and the abundant harvest spread quickly, and so did the colonisers along the river reaches. It wasn't long before our people lost access to the river and lagoons, to our yam beds, animal traps, fishing places, paths and ceremonial grounds. Our people fought back, raiding outlying farms and using fire as a weapon. Colonists shot our people to protect their crops and took our children, claiming they had been abandoned. In September 1794, along the lowlands of Marrang Ngurra, Richmond, just downriver from here, a young Aboriginal boy was reported to have been bound and tortured by some farmers, then thrown into the river and shot. A series of attacks followed before colonists organised themselves into a posse and set out and shot a group of 7 or 8 of our people. This was the first recorded massacre of Aboriginal people by settlers.
We can read this long frontier war on Dyarubbin as like a series of cycles of violence that just increase over time and really spiral out of control. After that first massacre in 1794, things were quiet for a few months, but then in December 1794, the killing started again. Joseph Burdett was killed, followed by 3 more settlers in May 1795. All these settlers that were killed took land that was on the farthest fringes of that already small settlement. It's likely that this was a military strategy by the Dharug warriors to force the settlers to leave their country. They also sent an envoy to Sydney, a most unusual man, an ex-convict called John Wilson, who had left the white settlement and joined the Dharug clan on Dyarubbin a few years earlier. He'd even been scarified according to their rituals and given a new name, Bunbuoy. Governor Phillip, the first governor to meet the Dharug people in 1791, had acted in such a friendly and peaceful manner. I'm sure that the Dharug elders felt that that promise of friendship had been betrayed, and that may have been one reason they sent Bunbuoy, John Wilson, to Sydney. Unfortunately, Governor Phillip had already left and acting Governor Patterson was in place, and instead of seeking some solution to this problem, he sent a large detachment of soldiers out to the Hawkesbury, marching out overland. And the night after they arrived, they attacked a group of people, including men, women and children. And they started shooting and chasing them. 7 or 8 people were killed. They also took prisoners, 5 women and a crippled man. One of the women had been wounded and she had a baby who later died. And another of the women was heavily pregnant and she had the baby, and that newborn died also. This massacre is now remembered as the Battle of Richmond Hill. We don't actually know the site where it happened or the names of the people who were killed, and it wasn't a battle in a European sense, it was more a massacre, and it's also the first military massacre in modern Australian history. And there was payback. The Dharug warriors killed farmer William Rowe and his 3-year-old child at Richmond, and his wife Mary Rowe was nearly killed as well. And after this event, soldiers were stationed permanently on the Hawkesbury.
William Rowe's farm was just across the river, upstream of here. Burubiranggal elder Auntie Edna Watson and Uncle Alan Watson recall the creation of a memorial to the Dharug people killed in this massacre, a large stone gurragulung, long-necked turtle, in the grounds of St John of God Hospital on Richmond Hill.
Edna planned the memorial.
The turtle is our family totem, but it's also along the river. That's why we said the long-necked turtle. The legs come out and with the body...
It's a pool of reflection.
Yeah.
The gardens had native plants, and when it was done they asked Edna to do the welcome and the opening, and Uncle Wes was there, he done the smoking ceremony, and everybody had to pick up a rock from the pile and bring a rock and make a can.
So we did that.
And then each time after, 12 months after, we'd have a meeting up there
and they put
a talk and put another rock on the can. And
they say that the people that are in the hospital there, they come down and sit and they also clean up around it. They said it's a good thing for therapy for the people up in the hospital. It's a quiet time for them, It doesn't matter who does it, as long as there's something there for the people to reflect on.
Government policies that legalised killing Dyarubbin's first people, taking our children and breaking up families were enforced from the early days of colonisation into the 20th century. Racism drove our culture and language underground in what anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner described as the Great Australian Silence. Colonisation has wrought a traumatic toll on our people that is ongoing. Aboriginal people and culture have endured this toll. Our language is being revived, words and place names are reawakening, fragments of stories and lives being reconnected. This river, Dyarubbin, is our sacred highway, our creator, our provider, the central thread of Ngurra to the Dharug people.
By now you may be approaching the bridge. Built in 1905, this Monia concrete arch bridge has 13 spans and is 50 metres longer than the old wooden bridge at 212 metres long. A third column was added at each pier in 1926 to support a railway track for the Kurrajong line, which ran until 1952. They now support a widened road deck. It's one of the earliest surviving reinforced concrete road bridges in New South Wales and is a state heritage item, but is built below the 1 in 2 chance per year flood event and has been submerged by 3 floods already in 2022. Planning is currently underway to build a new bridge at the very end of this park. With a deck 6 metres higher, this new bridge would achieve the 1 in 5 chance per year flood event level. Pansy was the name of the train that ran between Richmond and Kurrajong from 1926 to 1952. Lawrence Duffy recalls the railway his dad helped build and was interviewed in 1984 for the On the Record project.
My father worked on the railway for some time as a young man. According to what he's told us over the years, he put his age on to 21 to get a start on the railway, and of course this didn't go real well because the ganger found out about it. Of course he copped a lot of the hard parts of the job. However, it was completed in 1926, and it was a great boon to the local people here who in those days produced a lot of meat, vegetables, fruit. It was a very large fruit growing area. Transport being what it was in those days, it was a matter of taking it by bullock drays or horse and carts, which you imagine be a very slow process. This was one of the main reasons it was built, for carrying goods and produce to the markets.
The building of the railway coincided with the commencement of sand and gravel mining from the river, just upstream at Yarramundi. An aerial cableway carried sand and gravel along the river's edge to a processing depot just over the bridge at the corner of Yarramundi Lane. Kevin Burns, also interviewed in 1984, recalls catching pansy to the river from Riverston most weekends in the 1940s.
When I was a lad, I used to go up there fishing all the time, and rabbiting. We used to get off at Richmond and catch old pansy. She used to go through the park at Richmond, then onto the road, follow the road down, and then get off at the river station that was named Phillip. There was 19 railway sleepers, and that was the station. And then we used to go down and do our fishing. Used to camp down there every weekend, yeah. On the riverbank there was trellises there with a heap of old vines and that growing. We used to camp underneath those. In those days the river was normal times, only little running streams going through it. The reason being that there was no dam there then, and it was a consistent flow all the time. Yeah, a lot of fish in the river, yeah. Mullet and perch, and it's a lot different to what it is now. It's beautiful and clean and running all the time. Where the pansies going across the bridge, everyone used to stand out on the front of the carriages as it went across the river and have a look at it.
Before we leave the bridge, try to imagine yourself here during one of 4 floods in 1870. A very fast-moving flood. The river, its banks largely stripped of their native forests by colonists for farming, seemed to be swallowing vast swathes of ground. Around 50 acres was reported as being washed away. George Matcham Pitt and his father, who lived just over the river on the Richmond side, witnessed one of 3 massive landslides that took place in this area during that flood. On hearing a noise, they looked towards the river
and saw about a 1/4 acre with oak trees upon it, sliding rapidly into the stream through an opening in the immediate bank of the river. The opening was much narrower than the moving land, but this seemed to be in a soft and yielding state, and so found its way through the narrow opening. The trees on the slip did not fall over into the stream, but seemed to gradually sink down into the water. J.P. Josephson, A History of Floods in the Hawkesbury River.
Heading back now towards where our walk began, you might notice a tall green signpost from the Hawkesbury Artists Trail by the path above the jetty. It bears an image of another of Arthur Streeton's paintings from 1896, Summer Noon, depicting the river right here with the old wooden bridge, viewed from the other side, almost as much sand as water. Marrang Ngurra Sand Camp. Our people mark this area for its vast wealth of sand. Let's head along the grass now, beyond the paths, along the river towards the northern end of Hanna Park. You might like to traverse down to the river's edge or stay up here on the higher part of the bank. The river at North Richmond today is quite shallow, but it hasn't always been like this. Just downriver from where we are now, boat builder Jonathan Griffiths was granted 100 acres in the early 1800s. Griffiths was an ex-convict who'd been sentenced to transportation and 7 years for grand larceny at the age of 15. Griffiths launched sailing boats here, as big as 90 tonnes with a 15-metre keel, sloops and cutters for transporting grain to Sydney and coal from Newcastle, brigs that became sealers and whalers voyaging to Macquarie Island and New Zealand. Boat building on the Hawkesbury waned as erosion from land clearing caused the river to silt up. By 1803, a ship had run aground at Richmond Hill. Some Dharug and dark and young people along the river also became sailors, joining some of these voyages. Rock engravings in the Cat-Eye and Sackville areas depict sailing boats. Mining sand by dredging it from the river remains a contested issue. Ted Brooks, former Hawkesbury City Councillor and descendant of Hawkesbury boat builder John Grono.
When they built a Warragamba Dam, they dredged sand all around North Richmond and above North Richmond, up to the mouth of the Gross, and they took that sand up to Warragamba and used it for the concreting up there. And as soon as they'd run out of sand, well, they'd have to stop dredging till we get a flood and wash it down again. The river is silting up. I fought battles on that council, and I said, you need to take out just 2 metres down the middle. I went to Europe, Austria, and places there where they dredged everywhere, and talked to people, and it's so simple to do. And I said, here in the Hawkesbury River, you could dredge 50 metres wide and 2 metres deep, just straight down the middle of the river. And all the sand, I've been pushing for a new high-level bridge up at North Richmond. I said the sand in the river's ideal, to do those projects.
Once you reach the end of the park, you can head back to where we started the walk in your own time. Dr. Ian Wright, Senior Lecturer in Water Science at Western Sydney University.
We've extracted so much sand and gravel out of the river, and that was a really important part of its physical makeup. In high flow events, the eroded sediment is actually a really important part of the stream environment. We've changed it forever. So there are areas that are now deep that used to be much shallower. So they had shoals. They've been removed. And all of that changes the river. We change the flow, we change the sediment, we've changed land uses, and we've discharged waste into it. And surprise, surprise, the river's as good as it is. The big source of contamination in an urban waterway is sewage. And every person in Sydney generates something in the order of 200 to 300 litres per day of wastewater. That is from the toilet, bathroom, laundry, washing machine. Multiply that by 5 million people and you've got gargantuan volumes of sewage. Now all sewer pipes leak. Most of it gets to the sewage treatment plant where it's discharged and released, but how much leaks? About 10%. I looked at the Hawkesbury and the lower sections of the Nepean, so Penrith to North Richmond, and in summer last year it was about 30% effluent, the flow in the river. It's treated, generally a bit more than primary, secondary and tertiary. The level of treatment is getting higher. But we do drink it. We do drink it at North Richmond. It's extracted out of the river and it's highly treated. There is an inherent conflict there that it's impossible to dismiss completely. Sydney, the latest figures I've seen are we use 295 litres per person per day of water, which is outrageous. England's about 150 litres per person per day. Melbourne is 161. Some of the Sydney suburbs, like the Rouse Hill area, there's 32,000 houses that have a purple pipe of treated effluent come to their house, and they use it for toilet flushing and in the garden. They don't do it anymore though. It's not economic, it's cheaper to just use water once and then dump it in the river. And this is my problem. We are in a very dry continent. We need to be very conscious about water. But whenever I talk to people in Adelaide or Perth, they're constantly in water stress. They are stopping discharging waste to waterways because they know that that's a really important resource. They can treat it and reuse it for beneficial, for irrigating the farms, for flushing toilets, for washing cars. They can even treat sewage to a level now that you can use it in the laundry. You can do that economically. It actually costs more in terms of energy to desalinate salt water like we are at Kurrajong. So for me, there's a disconnect happening and people don't realise that more urban growth coming to the Western Sydney, we are sending more effluent to the river.
I remember one time down at Redbank Creek and I'm doing water testing and a whistling kite flew over. I'm going, what's it got? And it had a big eel in its talons, flailing around as it flew over. If you get down here, you can see a real lot of interesting stuff. It just requires slowing down and taking your time.
The Hawkesbury River is home to the short-finned eel and the long-finned eel.
Also home to yellow-finned bream and swamp harriers.
Different types of fish, like bass and all the other ones.
I live close to the Hawkesbury River.
And I live right next to the river.
I walk my dogs next to the Hawkesbury River. I like to go skiing on the Hawkesbury River.
And I have to cross the Hawkesbury River just to get to school.
And I know the Hawkesbury River is very long.
I know that the river has been around for a very long time.
Children from Hawkesbury Independent School in creative workshops on the river in 2019.
We hope you've enjoyed 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin's audio walk at North Richmond. For more information, please see Hawkesbury Regional Museum's website. There are 10 other audio walks along Dyarubbin you might like to listen to.
Naba Wunya, see you soon. Remember Midaga. This country is alive with the Gumuda spirit of our Burubiranggal ancestors, who've cared for this country for countless generations. Tread softly on this dreaming. Take care of Dyarubbin. We were strong here, we remain strong here, and we will always be strong here.